With just a little over 2 weeks left until Victory Day, the massive yearly celebration of the defeat of Nazi Germany in the Second World War, it seems appropriate to discuss what plans Vladimir Putin might have to secure, if not victory, then at the very least a significant success in Ukraine. Now, you might be wondering what all of this fuss about May the 9th, Victory in Europe Day, is all about. Is there any reason for Russia to push for a big score before this date in particular? Is there any reason to commit to the risk of a major military operation just to meet an arbitrary date? Yes, there is. V-Day in Russia is so much more than a simple celebration of a war that ended some 70 plus years ago. In the words of Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, referring to this year's Victory Day parade, quote, "We will celebrate it the way we always do. It is the holiest holiday in our country. It has been and will remain the holiest holiday for all Russians." End quote. It's a pretty big deal, especially to a president like Vladimir Putin, who has presented himself domestically and abroad as a strongman leader who wishes to maintain Russia's position as a global power. A position that has taken more than a few dents over the course of the last 2 months, both militarily and in terms of Russia's reputation. So where precisely does Russia go from here? What is Putin's plan to salvage the situation militarily, economically, and prestige-wise? Let us begin with the economic part, simply because it is the situation we can see most clearly, and because it is from hence everything else flows. With a thriving economy, Russia can wage war for eternity and a day, and the enmity of other nations will be tempered by good old-fashioned greed and necessity. See, for example, the recent wave of Western companies deciding to boycott Russia, but remaining all too happy to peddle their wares in certain other nations, with plenty of murders and occupations on its conscience as well. Yes, there are very few crimes that enough money cannot excuse. The economy is also one of relatively few areas in which Russia has been able to score some telling victories against its opposition, despite fighting a trade war against damn near the entirety of the rest of the world. And the reason for that is, of course, gas. Russia has it, and Europe must have it. For reasons entirely of Europe's own making as well, mind you. Germany, just a few months ago, finished the closing down of all of its remaining nuclear power plants. This in an effort to go green, and yet, in a shocking twist none but every single living soul on Earth could have predicted, the sharp, sudden drop in energy production domestically did not see a sudden drastic drop in the demand for energy. Rather, it simply meant that Germany had to dig and burn more coal and import more gas, which has left the German political leadership in the pinch-tricky position of having to explain why they are condemning Putin's illegal war whilst funding it with gas imports simultaneously. Europe's dependency on Russian gas has also allowed Russia's economy to remain standing despite the hammering. As you can see here, the ruble at first took what in professional economic terms is called a flying dive off a fucking cliff, before having an equally dramatic rebound shortly thereafter, in large part due to Putin's demand that Russian gas be paid for in rubles. A demand that's currently doing the long and circuitous rounds in the EU, though it seems likely that several nations will have to bend the knee and, ironically, prop up the Russian economy. Germany, meanwhile, at least so far, remains steadfast, even though the German state has had to be somewhat, creative with the legal definition of private property and company rights, etc. The pay with the ruble's strategy, though, is most likely a stopgap measure that will not work forever, as Gazprom, a major Russian gas supplier, is reeling and feeling the strain as more and more European countries may soon resort to more draconian actions to keep their citizens' homes heated. Though, to be fair, Russia has engaged in a little bit of piracy as well. In the short term, then, Russia can weather the storm of sanctions, but it is becoming more and more pressing for a resolution to the conflict to manifest sooner rather than later. Russia is no longer the Soviet Union, which could rely almost entirely on its own internal market. The longer these heavy sanctions continue, the weaker the Russian economy will grow, whilst the West's position will only improve. Russia supplies a third of the West's gas, not because we don't have any of our own, but because it's cheaper. Not cheap enough, however, to outweigh the clear and urgent need to find alternative sources of gas as the Russian threat becomes more dire. Which brings us to the question of how to resolve this special military operation, as it is called by the Russians, that has gotten so far out of hand. Initially, the aim appeared to be to take control of the eastern bank of the Dnieper River and the southern areas of Ukraine. These are regions primarily inhabited by Russian-speaking people. Kiev, of course, was also a major objective, but more so for the prestige of seizing the capital quickly, with VDV elements trying to encircle it on days 1 to 3. The original objective, however, is no longer an option. The mass-scale retreat from the north of Ukraine has reduced Russia's options significantly. Options that must now be considered by one Alexander Dvornikov, the new Russian commander in charge of Ukraine. It is difficult to determine what effect, if any, his appointment has had or will have on the campaign, as yes, the rate of Russian casualties seems to have slowed dramatically. But how much of this is to his credit? And how much is to the fact that after retreating from Kiev and northern Ukraine, the Russian army has eliminated most of their immediately obvious weaknesses in terms of positioning? Personally, I would probably attribute that success primarily to the latter elements. And whilst obviously finally putting a brake on attrition is a good thing, if we assume that Putin wants a victory, then something offensive is going to have to happen, and happen soon. Actually, even as I write this right now, Sunday morning, there are indications that the massive Russian movements ever since the retreat are just about ready and reorganized enough for another big push. And Alexander had better make it a good one, as the odds are stacked against him. Unless Russia begins a large-scale mobilization and starts waging a full-scale war, and make no mistake, Russia has been holding back so far, then this is probably Russia's last chance to carry out a significant offensive. Let me expand on that for a little bit. Why would the odds be against Russia right now? Well, firstly, it is the now glow-in-the-dark levels obvious fact the Russian army has enormous logistical and communications issues. Are there any signs this has been resolved? Kind of, to an extent. The retreat from Kiev and northern Ukraine went remarkably quickly and effectively. I feel like there's a joke there about being very good at running away, but reality is that a well-organized, successful withdrawal in the face of the enemy is one of the hardest military maneuvers in the book. One that the Russian commanders carried out, by all indications, practically flawlessly. Granted, that does not necessarily mean that they can do the same in reverse, but after 2 months of glaring issues, it is far from impossible that someone in the General Staff had the brilliant idea to study logistics rather than tactics. There is also the possibility that Alexander Dvornikov has brought along his experience from Syria, but once more, considering he has only been on the job for a little over 2 weeks, his impact has probably been quite limited so far. It is not just the Russians' own struggles that are the problem, however. The area for the decisive battle is almost certain to be the Donbass front. a region that has been heavily contested since day one. The Ukrainian army knows every inch of the oblast and have undoubtedly been planning to defend it for the last 8 odd years, as it was and still is one of Russia's top priority targets. And as if an entrenched and prepared enemy wasn't enough of a problem, with the Russian withdrawal, Ukraine has been given plenty of time to finish its own mobilization and internal reorganizations. The Donbass front will almost undoubtedly have been heavily reinforced with fresh personnel and potentially brigades released from other areas of operation. Now, Russia does have significant forces in the region, and we will get into as much specifics as we can, but numbers-wise, it is not looking all too charming for the invaders. On the northern Donbass front, we have the 20th and 41st Combined Arms Armies, along with the 1st Guards Tank Army. There are also indications that at least elements of the withdrawn 2nd Guards Combined Arms Army and the 35th Combined Arms Army are operating in the areas as well, though how combat effective these troops might be is most certainly a question. But let's go a little more granular, as fancy titles like Army somewhat overstates the current Russian strength. With several formations tied up by a slow and steady Ukrainian counteroffensive around Kharkiv, the forces available to push in from the north would be roughly 4 partial divisions: the 106th Airborne, the 3rd and 2nd Motorized Rifle Divisions, and the 4th Guards Tank Division. Altogether, they command some 4 to 6 motorized rifle regiments and 3 to 4 tank regiments. Meanwhile, along the eastern sides of the northern front, the 127th Motorized and 90th Tank Division will provide fixing troops. This leaves the rough equivalent of 3 to 4 brigades available for offensive actions, and remember that, as it will be important in just a little bit. In the main separatist-controlled areas, we have the 5th Combined Arms Army, along with the 1st and 2nd Army Corps, with a combined strength of roughly 3 brigades and 2 regiments. This front has seen practically zero forward movement so far, and this is unlikely to change now, as it is sat opposite the most heavily entrenched and prepared Ukrainian positions. They will, in all due likelihood, be a simple fixing force. More interestingly, to the south we have the 58th and the 49th Combined Arms Armies, and several attached VDV and Marine Infantry formations. Significant portions of this strength, perhaps as much as 5 to 6 brigades, however, is currently tied down fortifying and defending the city of Kherson, along with the western bank of the Dnieper, against a potential Ukrainian offensive. The Ukrainian army elements in the area have been carrying out aggressive reconnaissance and probing for the last 2 weeks, probably with the view of pushing Russia back across the river. The Russian army cannot ignore this threat, as should the Ukrainians be successful, their entire eastern flank would lay exposed to the Ukrainian army, as there are several major strategic roads heading out of Kherson and into the soft rear of the Russian forces. Then, of course, there is Mariupol. The city's defenders have been largely reduced over the preceding months, but Azov and Ukrainian Marines are apparently still fighting in and around the Azovstal steel plant. Their position, frankly, seems hopeless, but they are tying down valuable Russian troops, most notably the elite 810th and 155th Naval Infantry Brigades. This leaves only around 6 motorized rifle regiments and 1 tank regiment to hold the north-facing front and carry out any potential attacks from the south, the rough equivalent of perhaps 2 brigades. All in all then, the Russian side have maybe as many as 6, possibly 7 to 8, roughly brigade-sized formations to employ, if we are to be generous. Meanwhile, on the Ukrainian side, we have the elite 25th, 81st and 95th Air Assault Brigades, the 59th and 57th Motorized Brigade, the 30th, 54th and 24th Mechanized Brigade, and the newly mobilized 3rd and possibly 4th Tank Brigade. A potential 10 brigades to the Russians' 8. Now, of course, the Ukrainian brigades have been in combat for 2+ months. Surely they will have suffered casualties in men and materiel. And in reality, we can only guess as to their current state. But the same is true and likely to an even greater degree for the Russian formations. And whilst Ukraine's mobilization phase is now finished, giving them access to an enormous number of reserve personnel, Russia has yet to even begin its own mobilization, meaning that spare troops will be in far shorter supply. Furthermore, of course, being the attacker, Russia will have the opportunity to choose the battlefield and will undoubtedly strive for local superiority, yet nevertheless, it is an unenviable position that Alexander Dvornikov finds himself in, as his options are severely limited. The safest and most long-term effective thing to do would be what I suggested in my How Can Russia Win video a while ago. Hunker down and let superior air and artillery reduce the enemy one position at a time, in accordance with Erhard Rauser's idea of a snail's war. A doctrine ideally suited to the Russian battalion tactical group as well, I might add. Shameless self-shilling intensifies. I did do a video on the battalion tactical group as well, so check it out if you want to know more. The last couple of weeks seem to have justified my position on that as well, since the Russian army has been doing just that. They have been making slow but steady advances in the direction of Slavyansk and down the various minor roads in the area, with relatively few Ukrainian victories. At least nothing like the constant stream of burnt-out tanks and IFVs we saw during the Kiev offensive. If given a few months, maybe half a year or so, Russian fire superiority along with waning media attention might well leave Ukraine in a sticky spot. But the problem is, of course, that with Victory Day mere weeks away, the Russians don't necessarily have that kind of time. So bearing in mind the limitations in terms of schedule and troops, what, if anything, can be done, and is likely to be done? The most probable scenario is that very soon, this week probably, if it hasn't happened already by the time you're watching this, that a major attempt will be made in the direction of Slavyansk. If successful, another rapid drive will then be launched towards Kramatorsk, and down these two roads heading towards separatist territory. If everything works out, it would create a small pocket to the north, encapsulating elements of 1 or 2 Ukrainian brigades. Not a massive victory, and certainly not a war ender like the closure of the Donbass pocket in total would be, but with a little bit of spin, it should be victory enough for Putin to report significant gains in the ongoing military operations. The problem is that this is the only really feasible option, and so Ukraine will know it as well. The area is not overblessed with roads, so an ambitious Russian drive to the west instead to try and close that aforementioned Donbass pocket would require them to either take Kharkiv, which is extremely unlikely, or move along small roads towards Pavlograd and the Dnieper River, whilst the South Army forces would have to move north and take Zaporozhye, or at the very least secure the northwards bound M18 highway. These are things the Russian army has been trying to do now for damn near the entirety of the war, and somehow I find it unlikely that they will succeed now all of a sudden. Unless the new general really has quite a lot in common with a certain other Alexander from antiquity. Or, if Putin decides to do something drastic, there could potentially be another option. We are moving on into the realms of proper theory crafting here, but very interestingly, the Russian state recently warned the US was planning a false flag operation in Ukraine, employing nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons of mass destruction to frame the Russian army. They even helpfully pointed out that these false flags might be planted in Slavyansk or Kramatorsk, objectives we mentioned mere minutes ago. Now, if I was a suspicious man, such precise mentions of where a tactical nuke or two might suddenly detonate would probably raise an eyebrow or two. And certainly, from a purely military standpoint, a few Tu-22M3s equipped with nuclear-capable Kh-47M2 Kinzels, the hypersonic cruise missile that Russia has already tested on 3 occasions in Ukraine already, with conventional warheads then, of course, well, battlefield nukes have never really been tried before, so birds alone knows just how effective they might be. But logically, if your objective was to clear a quick and dirty rush down a road to secure a rapid encirclement, then near instantly deleting 3 to 5 kilometers of front line here and there may very well do the trick. To illustrate this, let me show you the nuke map. I have placed a 500 kiloton marker on Slavyansk, here with the 500 kilotons being the max estimated payload of the Kh-47, and as you can see, it would not be pretty. Obviously, the ramifications for doing this would be severe, economically severe at least, that is. Even if tactical nukes would be used, I am 98% certain NATO and the US would do nothing about it directly, beyond increasing sanctions and probably stepping up aid to Ukraine yet further. Conversely, this is also one of the reasons I simply can't entirely dismiss the notion of a tactical nuke, or 3, being used. Because if NATO and the US have already rejected a direct military intervention, and for all intents and purposes they have, then stepping up aid and sanctions are the only recourses, and, well, NATO and the US are already doing that. So it would not be a surprise to me in the slightest if in Putin's mind he's thinking, alright, they're already doing their worst, so why the hell not? And the justification is there. In Russian law, it says that Russia can and will use nukes if, quote, in the case of aggression against the Russian Federation with the use of conventional weapons when the very existence of the state is put under threat, end quote. Now that might sound constrictive, only if the very existence of the state is under threat, but think about it. In a world where the definition of woman can be people who menstruate, do you really think that Vladimir Putin can't find a way to stretch the definition of threat and existence? Yeah, if he wants to do it, he will do it, and Putin has always been known for being the statesman always willing to go one step further than anyone else. To be clear though, I don't think it is likely to happen, as I imagine Putin's immediate wish is to score a quick victory, beat his chest in public, and then unilaterally declare victory, the end of special military operations in Ukraine, whilst continuing to bombard and bomb just as before, if indeed not on an even larger scale. Again, Russia has been holding back. It possesses far more in the way of strategic bombing capabilities than it has displayed so far. The recent strike on Odessa, for example, by a few cruise missiles, is but a taste of what Russia could do if it gave up the pretense entirely and simply started bombing for realsies. something which might also become a strategic necessity as well, as the aid to Ukraine is being stepped up more and more. I have mentioned previously Russia's artillery superiority. Well, that superiority might very well be challenged in the near future, as Canada has decided to send artillery pieces to Ukraine. Now, 9 guns alone are not going to make a difference, obviously, but this opens the door to large-scale heavy weapons exports to Ukraine, not simply anti-tank guided missiles or a handful of outdated T-72 tanks rotting in a storage yard in Poland and Romania, but actual modern-day heavy weaponry, modern counter-battery systems, modern anti-aircraft missile batteries, perhaps even modern tanks or fighters. That would be a serious threat to any long-term military objectives that Russia might have in Ukraine, and it might kickstart Ukraine's ability to apply for full NATO status, as entering into NATO does have a series of requirements, one of which is that it has the same material standard as the other NATO countries. A condition that is essentially impossible for Ukraine to ever achieve unless the West lets them, by beginning to export the kinds of arms and armor that it considers to be up to standard. Are you beginning to see the whole very existence of the state put under threat justification yet? I'm sure Putin does. But to return to the realms of reality, my bet would be on a limited offensive again towards Slavyansk to create a small pocket and an immediate localized victory for Putin to brag about on the Victory Day celebrations, after which, in all due likelihood, quite soon thereafter, Russia will simply declare that the war is over, begin stepping down military operations, and soon thereafter the media, as it always does, will move on to the next disaster. And within a few months again, I would not be at all surprised to learn that the war in Ukraine was still ongoing, but nobody's talking about it anymore. As for Russia right now, simply just making the West forget about the conflict is its best hope and weapon. Ironically, it's not going to be bombs or missiles that win the day, but our short attention spans. Until next time, I've been Arch, thank you all very much for watching, and I've been forgetting this in the last couple of videos, but as I've pointed out in the previous ones, do take everything that I am saying here with a pinch or two of salt, as these are merely my uneducated guesses as a person with a deep and burning interest for military matters. Until next time, have a good day.